Something is not right when we see our economic system so deeply invested in the destruction of the natural world, a world that we are a part of and rely on for our very survival, whilst also leaving the basic needs of so many to go unmet. Joining us today for this evening's talks is Kate Raworth, an ecological economist and author of Doughnut Economics, Gail Bradbrook, co-founder of Extinction Rebellion. We also have Paddy Loughman, an independent strategist working with the Wellbeing Economy Alliance and the Green Economy Coalition. And finally, we also have Kofi Klu, who's a global justice activist. We're going to hear from each of our panelists in turn and then take questions from the audience. Over the next hour, we're going to be looking at the ways that we can reframe how we imagine, understand, and talk about the economic systems that we have built and that so deeply structure our lives, even without us really understanding how or why. What are the assumptions and values hiding behind the stories and metaphors that we use to talk about our economies? And is it possible for us to imagine using an alternative narrative instead? So can I ask that we go round to each of you, our panelists, and that you give a 1-minute introduction. Gail, I'll ask you to come on first.
I'm a co-founder of Extinction Rebellion. In one of my past lives, I was the chair of the Tax Justice Network, of the governing body of that organisation and network. And I have been somewhat obsessed with economics as an amateur. I used to take stalls onto markets and ask people to come and talk to me about economics, called Street School Economics. So a little bit obsessed, and think it's where it's all at, actually, or lots of it's at. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So yes, I'm an independent strategist with a background in innovation and brand consulting, essentially working on how to help people have ideas and choose better visions of the future. I'm now focused on helping people choose better economic visions to help tackle the climate and ecological emergency. Part of that is the project I'll talk about here, working with the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, Green Economy Coalition, and Dan Burgess to help put stories into culture that will accelerate our transition to a fair green economy that delivers human and ecological well-being, an economy in service to all life. We're in the early stages of that work. We currently have a working hypothesis based on shifting beliefs, consciousness raising, if you like, which I will explain a bit more in a moment. So it's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm Kate Raworth. I studied economics many decades ago and was so frustrated by what I was taught because it missed out most things that matter. I walked away from it and then found myself irresistibly drawn back when it became really clear that economics was going to get rewritten. So I wrote this book, Doughnut Economics, that came out 3 years ago. I spent 2 years going around presenting it, talking about the ideas, and then eventually thought, okay, enough talk, let's do the action. Who actually wants to do this? So I'm now setting up Doughnut Economics Action Lab, and we're hoping to be putting an online collaborative platform on the internet in a couple of months' time, fingers crossed, for working with teachers, community activists, cities, business, government, artists, anyone who wants to actually be part of transforming. And so obviously I'm part of this much wider ecosystem that we're all moving in. Let's work together, let's collaborate. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
I work in largely law-related global citizenship education within our communities. But I'm also currently the joint coordinator of the Extinction Rebellion Internationalist Solidarity Network. And that enables me to try and, work with linking Extinction Rebellion to many movements of rebellion, particularly within our Global South diasporan communities here and also in the Global South itself, to promote learning between our movements, the building of movements that will be able to deliver on winning this rebellion to address issues of a climate and ecological emergency, but doing so in such a way that we can also alter the power relations amongst peoples through developing Global Citizenship Assembly, and as part of that, address the core economic issues, which is to give recognition to the fact that a lot of the economic life that is going on today within indigenous communities is actually resisting the destructive wave of the current, neoliberal global economic expansion to many parts of the world, where indigenous communities are actually trying to prevent that to happen and to make people recognize that it's also very much part of the rebellion.
Thank you, Kofi. We're going to hear from each of our panelists in turn. So Kofi, would you mind answering this question? What, in your view, is the story that currently underpins our economic system? And what problems does this narrative pose from a global and climate justice perspective?
Currently, there is a global story that is being actively pushed by governments under pressure from corporations. It's being taught in our educational institutions across the world. And that is a simple story that we can keep extracting from the environment whatever we think human beings need, expend all of that, pay no attention to the destructive impact of that on the environment. So long as we think that we are having growth and development, that is okay. And this is the story. But then the fact of the matter is this, that despite hundreds of years of resistance to this particular story, because of the destructive impact on millions of people of many generations in colonized part of the world, we have this story still being driven and pushed very, very hard. Currently, the climate and ecological crisis that is resulting from this extractive plunder of the world's resources is drawing attention of many more people, particularly in the global north, to the threatening havoc, the boomerang effect from the global south to the global north of this particular model, and the story behind it. And but then, whilst there's now increasing questioning of this story, of this model of so-called development, of growth in the global north, in the global south, these very, very same governments, corporations, academic bodies, NGOs are even more vociferously pushing this story. And this is the tragedy of our times, the lies that are being told, the attempt to deny, particularly the people in the global south, the destructive, the destructive trajectory of this model and the stories behind it. So this is the challenge that we face. To what extent will the global south particularly, be heard, particularly the resistance to this story, to this model?
Would you like to expand on that and explain the ways in which this model is currently being employed and what organizations are kind of pushing it in the way that you described?
I would say that the major institutions of so-called world economic governance, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, various agencies of the United Nations, the European Union, and when it comes to Britain, the Department for International Development, the Commonwealth and Foreign Office, they are all pushing, these agendas and spreading these stories in the global south. And the beneficiaries, of course, are the corporations that's behind this story or use this story to legitimize the extractivist plunder and destruction of the environment and the routine of people's lives. And the impact of what is going on really is that we are having situations where, contrary to the fact that for the hundreds of years this model has been pushed, we have increasing underdevelopment and impoverishment of the vast majority of the people. We have increasing dispossession of people of their vital, resources. We also have literally the disemboweling of Mother Earth in these parts of the world, with the living in the trail of extractivist plunder, toxic waste that is poisoning lands, poisoning the air, poisoning water bodies, and literally leading to genocide and ecocide on a massive scale. But this is still being promoted as what will deliver development to and well-being to the majority of people, even though that this development in terms of prosperity of people is not being seen. So this is actually what we're talking about in terms of what is making ordinary people to resist land grabs, to resist extractivist mining and plunder, to resist the despoilation of their environment. So this is what is fueling rebellion, and this rebellion has been continued from one generation, to the other.
What I'm hearing here is that you're saying that both social injustices and environmental injustices are coming from the same common cause. Is that correct?
Definitely. That this whole obsession with the extractivist plunder, take whatever a few think ought to be taken out of the environment in order to commodify and make profit at the expense of all life forms, human life, plant life, animal life. All life forms are being destroyed, and pay no attention to that, and keep going so long as some people are making profit, and then spreading the lie that there'll be a trickle down from these, profits that a few are making to eventually make life better for all, and life is not getting better. So you can see that from the extractivist plunder of the resources in the environment, we see a whole range of social injustices, affecting people's health, people's well-being. We see destruction of cultures, of ways of living that are more in harmony with the environment. And so you can see how the economic model links into environmental destruction, leads to cultural and other forms of genocide. And now we are seeing massive destruction of all kinds of species, taking us further down the road of ecocide. This is really what the realities are.
So let's now unpick further this current story of free market capitalism that was described by Kofi and the problems that that's causing. So Kate, I would like to talk to you here and ask, can you explain how this current economic narrative came to dominate our view of economics? Where did it come from? What, in your view, are the kind of key elements of that narrative? And why are those elements chosen in particular?
Well, I think Kofi said everything. So powerfully put. And by the way, Jason Hickel is currently writing a book which is going to really do some fantastic work at setting out the long history of this. So look out for that this autumn. So look, I was a child of this economic mindset. I trotted off to university to learn it because I thought, a child of the 80s, famine in Ethiopia, a hole in the ozone layer. I thought I want to be equipped with the mindset and the skills that will help me do something about this. And I thought economics was where I was going to get it. So I studied economics at university. And so I got indoctrinated in this mindset. And since we're talking about beyond growth, I'm going to start with that one, bit hosepipe, right? That's the picture, that's the shape of progress of the 20th century. It's so deeply embedded in the economic mindset, it never actually gets drawn on the page. There is no picture in the textbook that shows you this exponential curve. And in fact, I think humanity's learned more about the exponential growth curve in the last 2 months than we have in the last 50 years, because we've seen it happen on an extraordinarily rapid scale, and what exponential actually means. And it's deadly. And yeah, that's what's been happening in our economies, and that's what's been judged as normal. So GDP, the one number to rule them all, was invented in the 1930s by a brilliant American economist, Simon Kuznets. He was asked by US Congress to come up with one number, because until then they were saying the economy's output was so many tons of grain and so many tons of steel, and they wanted to add it together. And he came up with this number and warned them from the outset, this doesn't tell you anything about people's welfare. But of course, the caveat got pushed away because the temptation of a single number is very high. And we went into and it's very useful when you're coming out of a post-war economy or even a war economy, like how much do we need to put over to armaments and how much do we need to keep the consumption going? And that was a useful tool for a war economy. It was a useful tool for post-war economy. It was a useful tool if you were in an arms race, the US versus the USSR, this great big competition of whose economy could turn out the most stuff. And so it became this literally pitch battle, so that when the OECD, this organization of sort of Western societies, was launched in 1961, Article 1A of the Convention of the OECD was to say their aim was to sustain the highest rate of economic growth. Like, this was just the goal, and it was accepted. And yet that shape that's been so deeply embedded and so destructive in all the ways that Kofi's just described, because it can only continually grow if it's extractive. Where's that coming from? What are you drawing on? What are you capturing there in the way that you're growing something? It's coming from somewhere. And yet, let me just step back and think more deeply about the metaphor of growth, because it's spring in many parts of the world. And there's one thing that we love is to see plants grow, trees grow, our gardens grow, right? We love growth. It's beautiful. We love to see our children grow. And that's a sign of health. So growth is a wonderful, healthy phase of life. It tells you something's alive in truly in living systems. But yeah, so you know, I've got 11-year-old twins. They're growing incredibly fast right now, but they won't grow forever. If they carried on growing forever, they literally wouldn't fit at my kitchen table. So things in nature don't do this. And nature isn't endlessly exponential. Things in nature, nature does this. And this is called a logistic curve or a sigmoid curve, the S curve. Little flick of the wrist and it's a completely different world. Nature grows, and then there's this turning point here with my nose, and then she grows up, she matures. And it's that maturity when we switch from saying that something's growing to something's thriving. And that happens in human populations, it happens in all living species. And if it doesn't happen, if nature carries on doing this, we know the name for that. We call it cancer when it shows up in our own bodies. When something tries to grow indefinitely as a subset of a healthy living dynamic system, we know that that endless growth is a deep threat to the whole, because it's going to destroy the whole on which it depends. So healthy systems grow and grow up. And yet we have an economic theory that assumes this growth phase is going to go on forever. And by the way, many people profit massively from that, because of course it's extraction, and it ends up in the hands of a 1% who extract the rents, who extract the interest, who extract by owning things that are made artificially scarce. They can capture rent, capture land value, capture repayments on mortgages. So we have an economic system that's designed with the expectation that it will continue to grow. And I want to just add that part of the reason why it's grown is because of cheap energy, right? It's not coincidental that the last couple of 100 years of explosive income growth has been fueled by phenomenally cheap energy, oil and coal and gas. And so we have to obviously leave that in the ground and in the last century. And therefore, but we've inherited an economic system. Many of us, this generation of us alive now, we have all been born into an economic system that was on this ever rising escalator of countries at very, very different income levels, but just this presumption that more is coming. And as Kofi said, and that more is better, and that somehow we should call that development. And if you've got a lot of income, we call you developed. And if you've got very little, we call you developing. And then there's this patronizing relationship and very extractive relationship between the two. But if we look at the impact of today's high-income countries, they ain't developed. I've never been to a country that can hold its hand up and say it's developed, because there's no country in the world that meets the needs of all of its people within planetary boundaries. All high-income countries are way over planetary boundaries, destroying the living planet in ways that, of course, ricochet back on the world's poorest people. So I never use the words developed and developing. And I really recommend everyone just to take that out of your language. We are all developing countries now from very different directions. And it also takes away that dynamic. I've sometimes shown a slide that shows that there's no country anywhere close to where we want to be, to people who are very senior executives in the world of aid, right? Western aid agencies. And there was a real eye-opening moment when they looked at that and said, oh, wow. So I suppose this takes away this developing relationship. So there's a deep paradigm that we need to undo. And it's all underlying this idea of endless growth. So we need to absolutely move beyond growth and move to the concept of thriving, which we know is what's health in our own bodies. And I believe that if we can make that metaphorical leap, use what we already know about bodily health, that health lies in balance and it's thriving. If we can move from the bodily health to planetary health and take that metaphor with us, that I think is our greatest chance of success of making this conceptual transition.
If we've come to accept that this flawed narrative of the economy that you just described so well, and it's doing great harm to both people and the planet, how do we go about designing an economy that's in service to all life and moving away from that model?
Here's a picture of the donuts, and I offer it as one way of drawing like a compass for 21st century progress. So imagine humanity's use of Earth's resources radiating out from the center of that. It means we want to leave nobody in the hole in the middle. This is a place where people are falling short on the essentials of life without the food, healthcare, education, housing, political voice, energy that every person has a claim to. And I can say that because these are crowdsourced from the world's governments, which means that all people in the world, they've recognized that all people in the world have a claim to this. It doesn't mean the government's got it right. They didn't get everything here. They talked about gender equality, not racial equality. And they didn't talk about community and culture, but it's got a lot of the crucial things. So we've added in social equity to cover a much broader set. So leave nobody in that hole, get everybody over the social foundation into this donut, but at the same time, don't overshoot the outer limits here, because there we put so much pressure on the planet. We cause Earth's life supporting systems to break down. These are the 9 planetary boundaries of Earth system science, which are only 1 decade old. I mean, that blows my mind. It's only a decade that we've had this Earth system science that's saying quite concisely and clearly, we think these are the 9 Earth supporting systems, life supporting systems of our planet, and we mustn't overshoot them. Yes, climate, but don't obsess with climate alone. Because if you try and fix climate in the wrong way, you're going to overshoot on biodiversity. You're going to destroy living systems. You're going to destroy land systems or water use. So we've got to look at them holistically. So that's the donut. And then already the shape of progress has changed. It's not this ever rising line of growth. It's balance. It's finding the space in between the two. And then how do we do that? Well, I think we just need to, 2 principles seem incredibly important to me. One, we need to create economies that are no longer degenerative by design. Everything Kofi was saying about the extractivism, that is degenerating Earth's living systems. We're literally running down the living planet on which we depend. We've got to shift from degenerative design to regenerative design, where we work with and within the cycles of the living world, locally and globally. And the second one is that we have inherited economic structures that are profoundly divisive, that through capital extraction, draw the return of economic activity into the hands of a 1%, capturing rent, and you end up with this 1%, deeply divisive. And so you get huge inequalities within countries, between countries. And we need to turn that into distributive design, where the value that's created is shared far more equitably with everyone who co-creates and uses it. And there's so many ways you can create distributive design. I'm talking about the ownership of enterprises, from corporate shareholder ownership to employee ownership, cooperative ownership, local ownership. Who owns the land? Who owns the data? Who owns the power to create money? Who owns the technology? Who owns the ideas? So all these ownership of the incredible assets, and who owns the global commons, right? We all do. And how do we protect the commons in ways that actually recognize a long heritage of the value of the commons, which got crushed by Western neoliberal economics, which told us the commons are a tragedy. And we need to actually recover deep knowledge that's also still alive elsewhere to say, actually, the commons are often a triumph if we can learn to organize. So from degenerative to regenerative design, from divisive to distributive systems. For me, these are the 2 key principles that will start bringing us into that donut from both sides.
I guess what you're talking about there is a real paradigm shift in our thinking, and thank you for enlightening us with that. So the next question, I guess, is how do we bring about that rapid paradigm shift that Kate was just describing, and is going to be a necessary response to the climate and ecological emergency? So Paddy, could I ask you to come in here? Essentially, if Doughnut Economics is focused on shifting the way in which we think, especially at the policy level, then I guess your work is perhaps more focused on shifting what it is that we believe at a cultural level, to complement and accelerate that effort. So I'm going to ask you this question in two parts. Can you first of all please share with us what you are doing and why does it matter, but also how do you envisage us applying your approach in the context of an urgent and massive scale of the climate and ecological emergency? Thank you.
First of all, thank you, Kofi and Kate. Kofi, I grew up in Cameroon in an oil family, witnessed corruption there firsthand. It's one of the reasons I'm here now. And Kate, thank you so much. Your book was one of the reasons I'm here as well. And it really feels like a moment of translating, like when we translated the Bible out of Latin. It's very exciting. So yeah, the project I'm involved in, the basic hypothesis for it, which very much stands on the shoulders of giants, so people like Kate and so many others, and is grounded in behavioral science, change theory, framing advice, and crucially the understanding that our stories shape us and therefore our world, is this. Stories in our culture, like rags to riches, onwards and upwards, hero's journey, give us beliefs like growth is good or even greed is good, which mean that we choose policies like prioritizing GDP growth, as we've been discussing, which then reinforce and sustain those stories, and round it goes. Stories give beliefs, choose policies, sustain stories. So we think the beliefs we currently hold mean we are choosing policies that design a divisive and degenerative economy, to borrow Kate's terms. An economy that is arguably responsible for the various crises we face: crashing capitalism, degrading democracy, rising inequality, dwindling health, and of course, the climate and ecological emergency. So we think we need to change our beliefs to choose different policies that reinforce and sustain different stories. The question is, what beliefs do we need to help us choose the policies that will program and redesign our economy to be distributive and regenerative, an economy in service to all life? Many of those new policies already exist, and in many cases are already being practiced or experimented with in the world, much like the Doughnut in Amsterdam, just not yet at scale. And we feel we need to essentially help people see those and choose them, experience them and choose them. So based on that hypothesis, our project is to collaborate with networks of storytellers and makers who are shaping the stories in our culture to help people experience the limitations of the current beliefs and encourage a shift to new ones. Where we've got to so far is that we've landed on three belief shifts born from three questions, which we've been using as an initial brief to storytellers. So I'm going to go through each of these three. So the first question is, how do we relate to nature? And that is a belief shift from we are separate from and superior to nature, current belief, moving to we are part of and depend on nature. And this is perhaps the most important of the three, the most fundamental. It's not hard to reveal it. Less than half the cells in the human body are human cells, right? So we are deeply interwoven with the fabric of nature. If it goes, so do we, because we are it. But changing that belief when so many have such a limited direct experience of nature isn't easy, so it's a challenge. The second belief is based on the question, what is our economy's priority? So at the moment, the economy is all about money. That's certainly before reading Doughnut Economics, that's how I think about the economy, it's money, right? And we need that to shift to the economy is about all life. Money is an incomplete measure of value. So a great example of that is that the work of unpaid and low-paid women in the world, often being done in the household, is roughly $10.8 trillion, according to Oxfam, which is 3 times the size of the global tech industry. It's just short of China's GDP, and that's the second biggest economy in the world. And we just don't value that. And the value of ecosystem services, so biodiversity, is often said to be double gross world product, so double global GDP. Basically, money and the way we think about that doesn't allow us to value these things properly. So we need a shift in there. And third one, how do we measure success? So at the moment, we measure success by productivity. That's what we think is how we think about success, productivity. And really, we need to shift that to success is measured by well-being. Interestingly, as has been said already, GDP is supposed to be about ensuring well-being. That is supposed to be the end. We've become a bit obsessed with the means, and we obsess instead over a number which counts oil spills, pollution, crime, murder, and lots of guns as good things, essentially, to make that number bigger. We have mistakenly been believing that if you count the pennies, the well-being will look after itself. And that is clearly not what is happening. So these belief shifts are a hypothesis. We've based them on a lot of understanding of the sort of various value models out there, Schwartz's, as you mentioned, Kate. And we need to carefully consider these in the context of COVID-19, of course. And so they'll likely evolve. There may be others that we add in. But the next steps now are to write this up into a bit of a playbook so that we can start using it for people, evolving the strategy in the process to respond to this current situation, and then to build a unit, so a small agile group which will work over the next year or several years, connecting and radically collaborating with various networks of storytellers deeply embedded in culture to encourage these belief shifts. And we're speaking to funders about that now. So I'm going to answer the second part of the question now, which is the role of this in the context of the climate and ecological emergency. So they say it's like all of these issues are sort of wrapped up in this thing underneath, this economic model underneath. And the climate and ecological crisis emergency is, you know, the mother of all issues, as Christiana Figueres would say it. But our approach is entirely grounded in this context of the CEE. A crucial thing for storytellers to recognize is that climate change or crisis or emergency or whatever we want to call it is no longer a story told by some, believed by a few, ignored by many, denied by several. Instead, it is the setting within which all stories must take place. So all of our stories have to emerge from this context now. Our task is to ensure that when they do, they help give us the beliefs that mean we choose a better future, better vision. Believing that we have that choice and seeing visions of that better world is paramount, vital. We've known for a while what's going on here and largely what to do about it. What's been lacking is the political will, and that has a lot to do with what we believe deep down. Our approach here is maybe subtle, but far-reaching. So the impact with the right level of radical collaboration can be great and fast, we believe, hope. We're on the cusp right now of this cultural phase shift, and COVID-19 has possibly accelerated it, revealed it. The master narratives are breaking down. They have been for a while, being exposed. The stories people hear and the beliefs they give them over the next few months and years will be pivotal. If people believe deep down that a degenerative kind of growth, an extractive kind of growth, or even greed is good, morally good, that it's the best way to alleviate poverty, the best way for development to happen, as many people do, and they really do believe that in a moral sense, they think they're doing the right thing, then we won't choose different economic policies. We won't even consider them. They won't even register. As the framing expert, Anat Shankar-Azaria puts it, I'll see it when I believe it. And if people believe that the planet is dead anyway, right, then we're not going to be motivated to keep it alive. If we want a living world to flourish, we need people to believe that's important and possible. So we hope that we'll be able to look back on this moment as the great turning, as Joanna Macy describes it, the shift from the industrial growth society to a life-sustaining civilization. But it could just as easily become a shift to the concrete world that Charles Eisenstein warns of. We can choose which of these we want it to be. Which one we choose, we believe, will depend on the stories we hear now and the beliefs that they leave us with.
I'd like to turn to you now, Gail. There's no doubt that Extinction Rebellion, alongside the youth strikes and Greta Thunberg, has been a huge part of the change in narrative that's been taking place in recent months around sounding the alarms of the climate emergency. And we're hearing establishment figures such as Martin Wolf, the chief economist commentator at the Financial Times, saying things such as, and I'm quoting him, that the way our economic and political systems work must change, or that they will perish. So, Gail, can we talk from your perspective how you see this unfolding? How do we bring about the rapid transition and the economy and the paradigm shift that's been described so well by the other speakers? And what role do you hope that Extinction Rebellion will play in this?
Thank you, Aaron, and everyone. And it's an honour to be here. What I would say is that the paradigm is shifting because this paradigm's finished. We're seeing capitalism begging for socialism right now. They've found the magic money tree, actually. It's a forest, it seems like. And when you've got the Deutsche Bank economists talking to folks at McKinsey, and McKinsey saying, on the one hand, this civilization's finished if we do what the environmentalists want and tackle growth as an issue, or we carry on as it is, and on that hand, this civilization's finished. We're having the start of some truth-telling, you know, by and some of the quotes from the IMF and others, that we cannot carry on as we are. And actually, like, what was interesting with COVID is that there was no choice. We have the choice to breach climate tipping points, unfortunately. I see our work in layers, and I think we're already doing those work in those layers as Extinction Rebellion. So to speak to each of those layers and really honouring what Paddy was saying in terms of stories, the first one about, you know, the story of ourselves in relationship to the natural world. It's not merely a story. It's a biological fact. I think Charles Eisenstein's brilliant work on the ascent of humanity makes this plain. And so what we can do right now, and you can do it from either a spiritual perspective. I identify as a pagan, and I pray in that way. But you can work with that story. The reality of the story is that it can be animistic, it can be scientific. I see both in complete alignment, actually, that we are a body in the body of the world, to quote Victor, who's working with Skinner and Mickey Kashtan on new stories at the minute. That we can feel our connection to nature, and that we can start to, you know, on a daily basis feel that, you know, that is part of our work in XR. And then, you know, the way the story's being told to each of us is wounding. It's deeply, we all carry deep wounds, and we can work on those wounds, and we can do what our regenerative cultures ask us to, which is to tend those wounds and the places that we've been separated, and resist the stories that we're being told to separated. And there's some great work by Ian Haney-Lopez looking at how stories are designed to divide us along racial and class and other lines. And we don't have to tell those stories. We can tell the stories that we see the attempt to divide us, and we won't be divided. You know, and we have our problems, but we won't be divided. And we can pay attention, as Kofi often reminds me, to our history of resistance, and look at all the ways that we have resisted those divisions. And I think that also is about loving ourselves, actually. If you listen to Valerie Cower talking about the revolution in love, is actually there needs to be a place of self-love in here. Because the story that we're somehow bad people, which I'm afraid does come from the progressive left at times, because we don't get everything right, to mistrust people's intentions and so on. It's very hard to be in that. So let's, in how we rebel, let's hold each other, including when we get things wrong. Then the cultural stories about what we value, yeah, that's about what we measure, and there are other measures out there. And actually the UK already measures well-being, but we just don't talk about it. There's lots of measures out there, lots of different ways we could do this. We need to get really clear that the UK is the #1 supplier of corruption services in the world. We're at the top of the financial secrecy index if you include our crown dependencies and overseas territories like the Cayman Islands. And what that means is that, you know, you have a story that says, for example, you know, there are these African leaders that are corrupt. The supply of corruption services comes from the City of London and other places, but they're one of the main organisers of this in the world. And And there are people benefiting from this current story, and they are our family, and we need to call them back home and say, you just don't get to do that to us anymore. And I think that's how we resist, really, is at the systemic level. There's so many brilliant ideas that we can do things differently, but how are we going to get there? You know, bring about an ecocide law, measure our economy and focus our economy on maximising well-being and minimising harm. How are we going to get there? I think it was Paddy who said it's about political will, and the way that you bring about political will, one important way is civil disobedience, and this can exist in this space, and we don't have to get ideological here. You know, I often avoid using the words capitalism and anti-capitalism and pro-social and this, because everybody has a different meaning to these words, and it puts us in camps. And this is not the time to be divided from each other. This is the time to unite. You have John Fullerton talking about regenerative capitalism, and there's a new a group, I've forgotten their name now, but looking at other ways of doing capitalism. And I don't know what the details are and whether I'd be in agreement, but I think there's a place for us all to have a grown-up conversation about how we want to do this. And I'm fond of quoting Milton Friedman, actually, who said that the great virtue of a market capitalist society is that by preventing a concentration of power, it prevents people from doing the kind of harm which really concentrated power can do. So there you have one of the fathers of neoliberalism saying that he doesn't want power concentrating and he doesn't want harm doing. Well, we know that 8 people have the same wealth as half of the poorest people in the world. And so if that was his goal, then neoliberalism failed. Mrs. Thatcher said that if capitalism, if the market system brought about more harm than good, then we should do something else. Adam Smith, by the way, said that when business people get together, it's usually to conspire against the people. So you can quote the sort of, if you like, other side and say, look, this is what we need to tackle. And we could tackle that in a global citizens' assemblies. You know, we can tackle that together. And XR is really, in its 2020 strategy, wanting to raise up, the way I would say it, raise up that prayer of a global citizen. I mean, picture a global citizens' assembly, folk. Only 10% of the people on it would be white. And that's who needs to be making decisions going forwards. So one of the things that I've been working with on for some time, and it is complicated with the narrative. It is complicated to talk. We looked at a cancer narrative as well ourselves, Kate, to talk about economics and the system and how our democracy has been captured and how our economy is on that exponential curve and killing life on earth, and that we can rebel. We can have a money rebellion is the language we've been using right now, and it could be done in lots of different ways. You know, you could withhold taxes, you could withhold rent, you could withhold debts, you could take on new debts and not pay them, lots of different possibilities. So it is much of a work in progress. And the way we could do it, though, you know, working on these subtleties of the narrative, so very much welcoming everybody's input into that, Paddy and others, is that we could ask people, you know, if you're not in alignment with bailing out business as usual and with a system that's destroying life on earth, are you up for joining the money rebellion? I'm nearly there, thanks, Aaron. Are you up for joining the money rebellion? And if you are, we'll give you a phone call and we'll ask you a few questions and we'll see, you know, would you do this if a group of people would join you? And so we can gather people together in different forms of economic resistance. And we would be calling for truth-telling, for a global citizens' assembly, and for taking care of each other. Thank you.
We're going to go on to questions now. So we'll have about 10 minutes of questions and we'll open the questions up to the various different speakers. I'm going to start with the first one for Kate, because there was some fantastic news from Amsterdam. Could you explain what that is? And also, do you think that could be applied here in UK as well, in the UK councils or nationally going forwards? Thank you.
So there's the donut. We are way over. Ever since we first created the donut, people said, can we downscale the donut to our place? Can we do it for our neighborhood, for our city, for our nation, for our community? And in fact, all the places named here, from Ladywood, which is one of the most underserved districts in Birmingham, to literally the EU 27, which is where I was in the European Commission just before this lockdown happened, and Costa Rica, which have embraced the donut for a national scale down, and the city of Amsterdam. These places are all saying, can we do it? I think, yes, we can, and we need to, because most governance doesn't happen at the global scale. It's happening in place, and that's where people really get together and make change happen. Working with the C40, which is a network of the world's most climate ambitious cities, we've done city level donuts for Amsterdam, Portland, and Philadelphia. We're asking this question, and you can think of it for your city or indeed your town or your nation. How can our city be a home to thriving people in a thriving place while respecting the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet? And that breaks down into these 4 questions for Amsterdam. What would it mean for the people of Amsterdam to thrive? Guess who best placed to answer that question? The people of Amsterdam. So what does it mean to them, and where are they? What's the status now? What would it mean for Amsterdam to thrive in its natural habitat, to actually belong in the ecosystem, in the biome in which that city lives? How does nature work in that place? How much carbon dioxide does she sequester? How much biodiversity does she house in the wildland next door? And what if Amsterdam aimed to be as generous as nature where it is? So that's local aspiration, thriving people, thriving place. Fantastic. It's great living here. It has to be set in the context of global responsibility. What would it mean for Amsterdam to respect the health of the whole planet? All embodied emissions in the food and clothing and electronics and building materials and all the consumer goods coming into the city. So its consumption footprint on carbon and land and fertilizer use, how, you know, massively over, like all high income cities. How do you come back within? And then one that's too much left out of these debates, what about the city's impact on people worldwide? And there's many ways you could look at that, through the city's investments, through its relationships, as Kofi, going back to where Kofi was talking about the extractive relationship that many high income cities and nations have to the global south. We focused here on labor rights in global supply chains, because it was a place where we could reliably get data from global exploitative labor conditions in context of food and electronics and clothing made for brands that are on sale in this city. So we linked it up. So Amsterdam City Portrait includes stats and quotes about modern day slavery on the cocoa plantations of West Africa, because that's part of the story. This is what it looks like. Lots of detail in there. This is what it looks like when you get city governments actually sitting around their portraits. This is photos from workshops we ran in last September in Portland and Philly and Amsterdam. And this is policymakers and city change makers using it as a tool for saying, how do we solve these multiple challenges? At the time, nobody had even heard of COVID at the time, but we would bring that in now as well. And guess what? It's regenerative and distributive design solutions that enable you to actually start solving for multiple ones of these. So I was very thrilled to see these conversations, because these folks were buzzing. They'd never met before, because one works on sewage, and another works on equality, and another works on carbon, and another works on local food, but they've never met. Suddenly they're meeting and they're working together. Going from, we made a public portrait, but what's really going to happen is when the city places on it their own examples, their own stories and histories and ideas. So I'm excited about them turning into something local. And last point I'm going to make, I saw some of the questions in the chat about what most surprised me about Amsterdam. Somebody asked me, what most surprised me was the city, who've embraced a really ambitious circular economy goal to be 100% circular by 2050. No one even knows what that means. That's like a Kennedy moonshot. And to be a fossil fuel free city by 2030. So no cars, no fossil fuel cars in the city in 10 years. So they said to us, okay, we've got all these goals. Yes, we want to do the donut, but we realize we can't do it with the organization that we already have. We can't do it with our existing structures. So they asked us to run a workshop on reimagining their organization. And we used this slide. I said, look, 20th century serving a growth city, and 21st century serving a thriving city. The 20th century was dominated by this question in the city: how can we make our city grow? 21st century, how can we make our growing city thrive? Because many cities are growing, the people are coming. So they're literally getting bigger in terms of number, but how do we make it thrive? 5 design traits. What is the purpose of the city? Is it to grow and expand and compete? Or is it to thrive and collaborate for well-being? How are you networked? Who are you buying from? Who are your suppliers? How do you relate to your citizens? So there's your citizens assembly, like bring it in. How are you governing yourselves? Again, who's got voice? Who's got a place at the table? Networks in terms of purpose and, in terms of the principles and the rules and the practice and culture and incentives of governance. And now down to the deep stuff. How is your city owned? Who owns the land? Who owns the data? Who owns the power to create money? And how is the city financed? Where are your finances coming from? Because if the city's earning its finance from extractive industry, you've got a problem. So just very quickly, we did this workshop with the city, and this brings up deep things about history, about where our city was built from, who has power, but this needs to come up.
And we can do that in our cities across the UK and around the world.
Oh, yeah. And I'm going to post in here a link to the blog I wrote. The whole point of doing it in Amsterdam is so that we could create a tool that we're going to share. So Doughnut Economics Action Lab, we're going to post this online, share it. And in my blog, there's a little form towards the end of the blog. If you're interested, fill the form in. Since we published on the 8th of April, we've had over 270 expressions of interest, from Bangladesh to Dublin to Liverpool to Delhi.
Thanks very much. So the next question is for Paddy. They said that they understand that your 3 beliefs are shifts, but they wanted to know, do people not understand these, not just intellectually, but more importantly, emotionally? And if so, I guess the next question is, how do we actually communicate people on that emotional level rather than just on the intellectual level?
I think what we are ultimately talking about here is the deep emotional level, what things people hold deep down and how they come to have those by the things they experience in the world, the stories they experience, the stories they tell themselves. And I see the point about top down. I think the point about this is people everywhere engaging with what kind of stories we could be telling at the moment, what kind of visions we could be choosing. So the intention for the way we would work is to very much network in that way. Something that's been really interesting for me as a thought is that the people for whom this system works the best currently are likely to be the least imaginative and find new ways of doing it, because they've never had to think of new ways because it's always worked. It's the people at the margins for whom it has always not been quite right who have the most imagination. So accessing people at the margins is a vital part of the effort. To draw out those stories and get those stories coming from those places. I think that's got to be that way. I don't feel like what we're doing, I certainly hope it isn't a top-down sort of approach. That wouldn't be the intention, certainly.
I'm going to come to Kofi now. Gail was talking about possibly using the tactics of a debt strike. I kind of just wanted to know from the Global South perspective, particularly, how debt has been used as a weapon and how it could perhaps be turned, in your view, from a weapon against people, but against the institutions that are perhaps oppressing us in the ways that you described.
Debt is used as a weapon of oppression, disempowerment, and genocide and ecocide from the very beginning of colonization, when colonizers will take from people they target for colonial enslavement, and then turn around and say they owe them, so they have to, work for them, right? And that is how, the system of chattel enslavement of African people came about, from the attempt to subject the indigenous peoples of the so-called, of Abiyala, or the so-called Americas to enslavement. And that's continued throughout the colonial era into even the so-called post-colonial era, which is just another form of colonialism we call neocolonialism. So, we still have essentially, you look at the immense crimes against humanity and crimes against, Mother Earth, actually the colossal crimes of genocide and ecocide committed during the period of colonization, only for them after that not paying, not actually effecting reparations for what has been robbed from these people, but then turning around and say, you owe us. And that system is what has continued up to now. So in effect, it is the peoples of the global north who really have to rally and engage in this money rebellion, various forms of it, in order to actually take from here what is owed the rest of humanity. And that is what will help to, begin to address, some of these problems. But it has been said that these problems have not been resolved now, largely because of the lack of political will. I disagree, vehemently to that. Political will has been with the masses of peoples of the global south who have consistently been in rebellion for hundreds of years against this, system. Only for the global north, the corporate and state forces of the global north to to violently repress that rebellion and block their attempt to transform, their societies and free themselves from this system. So I think what needs to happen, that is why it's important for interconnected, citizens' assemblies globally to ensure that people empower themselves, support themselves to take their rebellion to the level where together we can make the change and ordinary people across the world be the change that we want to see.
I'm going to have to cut you off there, I'm afraid, but thank you very much. So that's the end of the session today. Thank you everyone for joining us. This series was created by XR Money Rebellion because we believe it is pivotal in this time in history that economies and finance have a fundamental role to play in reclaiming our future. We'd love to hear your feedback. It'd be great to hear what you enjoyed, how we could get better, and what you'd like to see next. We're all ears in this time of lockdown. So please email us on moneyrebellion, that's all one word, @protonmail.com. That's moneyrebellion@protonmail.com.